Resiliency. We're hoping to bring you a number of topics and speakers to talk about real world experiences that can help you out. There will be a question actually coming to you later on about to seek your feedback, your input on the topics to be covered. I want to say thank you to the Virginia Environmental Endowment, which has raised the need for training on climate change related issues in Virginia and has helped to fund efforts to do that. So we want to thank them for that. So with no more ado, I'm going to introduce to you our first speaker, and he's also the moderator of the panel. We're very excited about our panel that's with you today. Ross Weaver is the Program Assistant Director of Wetlands Watch, where he has 6 years of experience working on coastal resiliency issues alongside a range of stakeholders, including academic institutions like mine, nonprofit organizations, and local, regional, and state agencies. He's a certified floodplain manager, a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners, and a Chesapeake Bay landscape professional. Prior to joining Wetlands Watch, he worked for the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission and the Institute for Environmental Negotiation at UVA. So with that, I will hand it to Ross. Thanks, Ross.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We're excited to kick off this resiliency series. I also want to thank the Virginia Environmental Endowment and APAVA for helping support this initiative. We've been working in concert with them on a few different training issues, and they've been great partners. So to kick off this first first series, we're going to start with Dr. Molly Mitchell from VIMS, who's going to be looking at reviewing predictions for sea level rise data, precipitation. Dr. Junyi Ming is going to be reviewing considerations of climate change for bridge design, specifically the Chapter 33 design standards, design considerations that he was an author of. And then to give us more of a local example, following that, I'll review how localities are beginning to revise their design guidelines. We'll be using the city of Virginia Beach as an example. And then we'll get into how we envision the rest of these feature training sessions, the kind of content that seems most relevant to folks. So with that said, I will kick it off to Dr. Molly Mitchell.
And actually, before Molly kickstart, I am just going to present a poll to everyone. I think all of our presenters would like to know where everyone is coming from. So give me one moment. Alrighty, you all should have a poll in front of you. Alrighty, so with about 77% participation, we have 36% coming from Northern Virginia, 23% from Central, 3% from Shenandoah Valley, 15% from Eastern Virginia, and 23% from out of state. So I see a few names come in, a few places come in: Houston, Texas, Maryland, Portland, and Southern Maryland. So we've got some good representation out here. And then one more question for all of our attendees. In what field do you work? So we have 16% from local government, elected or appointed, 36% from other local government positions, 22% from private companies, 7% coming in from the state level, and some others coming in the chat: conservation, DOD. So quite a wide variety. Alrighty, I am going to let Molly get started. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Let me get my PowerPoint up here really quickly. All right, so I'm going to talk today about how things are changing, and specifically I'm focusing on Virginia. and how things have been changing in Virginia. However, I noticed there were a number of people from other states. My email address is at the end of the presentation. So if you're interested in resources that are more specific to your state, let me know and I can share those with you. Okay, so we're going to talk about how sea level rise, precipitation, and temperature are changing Virginia, what's happened in the past, what we expect to see in the future, and how we ended up with something like this. This is a picture of Norfolk on a beautiful sunny day, about 2 blocks from the waterfront, but you can see that I'm actually driving through water in this picture. So how did we end up here, and what does this mean as we look forward into the future for our planning efforts? All right, so I just want to start really quickly by showing you a little bit about how we ended up in a place where we weren't really expecting. Okay, so this is tide gauge data. This here is a tide gauge. And tide gauges measure water levels every 6 minutes. They've been in Norfolk since 1928. Some of them in the country date back to the 1800s. So we have a long range of data on water levels. So this graph over here is showing us the hours of flooding in Ghent, Norfolk, as measured by the tide gauge. And so what we can see is that it is always flooded in the Ghent area of Norfolk. It's just it only flooded for a couple of hours when a really big storm came through. And so we can see from 1928 to 1959, we have 2 years that have more than 48 hours worth of flooding, but it's not a very significant amount of flooding. So during this time, we are building a lot of infrastructure. We're putting a lot of planning in, we're putting in sewers, we're putting in water, we're putting in houses, neighborhoods, roads, right? We move forward through the 1980s. And what we could say with 2020 hindsight is that flooding is occurring a little more frequently, but the hours of flooding is actually not really much higher. So you're getting these kind of extreme events where you get more than 48 hours of flooding more frequently, but you're still not getting that much more flooding. So during this time period, we are continuing to build out our infrastructure with the assumption that this is what our world looks like. So this is what our world looks like going out to 2012. So what we see is a really dramatic shift. And this red line is the worst year of flooding in prior to 1985. Okay, and now you can see that's actually a pretty good year. So what's happened is something that we really weren't expecting to see. And this is true, I'm showing you this with sea level, but this is true with precipitation and temperature too. Things have been changing at a rate we did not expect them to. And so that means we've been building things with a view of the world that's no longer accurate. Okay, so really quickly, because I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to explain to you what's causing this. Okay, so we have increased CO2 in the atmosphere, and that increases air temperature. That one's pretty straightforward. Now, the distribution of air temperature increases depends somewhat on weather patterns, but the overall air temperature increase is in a pretty connected way. So increasing air temperature leads to increasing water temperatures. As water temperatures increase, 2 things happen. We get ice sheets melting, and melting ice sheets contribute extra water to the oceans. The other thing that happens is we get thermal expansion of the water. So as water heats up, the molecules move faster and they expand, they take up more room. This is exactly how a pressure cooker works. So now we have more water entering the ocean and that water is taking up more space. Okay, so we also, as the ice sheets melt, they're changing the ocean circulation patterns. And so where the ocean circulation used to be moving at a particular rate that helped pull water away from the shorelines, it's actually slowed down. And as that circulation pattern in the Atlantic slows down, we get less water pulled away from the ocean or from the shoreline. And to just make it all more confusing, we also have land sinking going on. So this has to do with back in the last ice age, the big ice sheets actually depressed the land in the New England and Canada area and caused Virginia to rise up. Since those ice sheets melted, Virginia's been sinking slightly back down to a level area. So we have these, all four processes are contributing together to cause sea level rise. So there's a lot going on in Virginia. We actually have the highest rate of sea level rise on the Atlantic coast, and that is because there is so much contributing to it. The other thing that increasing air temperature does is it changes our atmospheric circulation patterns. When it does that, it changes our precipitation. So it changes the timing of precipitation, it changes the intensity of precipitation across the regions. And with changing precipitation, particularly with increasing precipitation and with sea level rise, we get a lot more flooding than we used to see. Okay, so now I'm going to go through, I'm going to start with temperature and precipitation and end with sea level rise. And I'm just going to show you how the changes happened over the recent past, and then where we're heading. I'm also going to try to be specific with you about when we're talking about modeled data and when we're talking about measured data. So these graphs I'm showing you are modeled data that have been back corrected, bias corrected to measured temperature data, okay? And so this is the average annual number of days between 1981 and 1990, where the low was above 70 degrees. So this is a hot day, okay, because the low is more than 70 degrees. And if we compare it to the same metric in 2011 to 2019, what we can see is the dark brown are the most hot days. And we can see that we're getting more hotter days, and that's starting to extend back into the western part of the state. So what are we expecting to see? Well, we're expecting to see that continue. And I've pulled out here, so this is the number of days above 90 degrees that we are looking at. And I've pulled out here, this is the graph for Surrey, Virginia. So it shows between 1981 and 2010, we typically have been seeing about 34 days that were above that temperature. Moving forward, we expect that to increase fairly steadily up to 107 days by the end of the century. So that is almost a third of the year, right, that we're talking about there. Okay, so changing precipitation. There's two ways to talk about changes in precipitation. One is total rainfall. So if you add up all the rainfall over the year, or in this case, over each season, how does that change? The other way we talk about it is in intensity. And so we're going to start with total precipitation and move to intensity. So what have we seen in the past is from 1976 to present. These colors indicate the percent change. So dark brown means there's been a decrease in precipitation in the winter generally across most of the state. The greens mean there's been a increase in precipitation, and the darker the green color, the more the precipitation has increased over that time period. And so what we can see is that in the summer, the eastern part of the state has had this increase in precipitation, and this is true for most of that area in the fall too. The western part of the state actually still has a little bit of a decrease. And I've called out here, this is Hampton, Virginia. And so you can see there's a lot of seasonality to it. There are some years where the precipitation is higher, some years where it's lower. This purple line is kind of that average, which you can see has gone up slightly. It's about 4.5 more inches of rain in the fall now than what we were seeing in 1976. But it hasn't, it's not a like a straight up kind of graph. Okay, so what are we looking at moving forward? Oh, sorry, this is still the past. Okay, changes in extreme precipitation. So how has that changed? So same idea, wherever you see brown dots, those are areas where actually extreme precipitation has decreased. And then where you see the green ones, that's areas where the extreme precipitation has increased. So we see a lot of increase in extreme precipitation on the eastern part of the state again. And the western part of the state, you see brown speckles in there. Most of them are pretty light brown, which means there really hasn't been much change. So these are moving forward, what do we expect to see in the future with that? These are IDF curves, inundation, duration, frequency curves. The red one is the current Atlantis 14 IDF curve that we would design for. This is for the 10-year return period. And it's suggesting in the next 50 years that this blue line up here, the model suggests that this will be a more appropriate design curve. This is for Richmond County, but so you can click on any of these stations and see the specific design curves for those stations. Okay, and so last, sea level rise. Again, we're going to talk about what has happened and then what we expect to happen. So these are annual means, basically, of sea level rise that have been measured at Sewell's Point in Norfolk using tide gauge data. And this goes back to 1969 and then up to present time. What we can see is that sea level has actually been steadily increasing, even though, again, you get some years where it's higher, some years where it's lower. The overall trend has been steadily increasing over time. And we can put an average line through that, okay? And so this is the, this is the average line that goes through there that shows mean, sort of the mean sea level trend over time, okay? So you can see, again, we get years that are higher than that trend, years that are lower than that trend, but those years oscillate around the trend. The dotted lines actually tell us in any given month, sea level could be as high as the top dotted line or as low as the bottom dotted line, depending on the month, the time of the year, and then also whether we're one of these peak years or one of these trough years. Okay, so if we look forward with that, there are two things I'm showing you here. The orange line is exactly the same graph I just showed you before with the blue annual mean sea level oscillating around it. We can extend that orange line out to 2050, and we can say based on the past data, okay, based on data from the past, we expect to see this level of sea level rise by 2050. It's a little under, so this is NAVD 88. So it's a little under 2 feet. NAVD 8 is what we would expect to see based on the historic trend. The purple lines are from climate models. These are NOAA's global climate models, so they are process-based. And so they allow you to say, well, what if things warm up faster than we expected? What if they warm up slower than we expected? How does that change things? So the purple lines, you can see the historic trend is kind of on the low end of the purple line. So the potential for things to change even more in the future is certainly there. The state of Virginia has picked the NOAA intermediate high curve as their planning one. So that is, let's see if I can get this here. That is this one here. Okay, so this is the planning curve that Virginia has been looking on. So I'm going to show you what this looks like on the ground. Okay, so this is Dyke Marsh area in Alexandria, Virginia. This is the George Washington National Parkway coming up here. Alexandria is right up here, and Mount Vernon is down here. And you can see here right now, this is water depth at high water and mean high water. So you can see that the marsh is basically underwater during mean high water in 2020. So that's what we expect to see. The marshes are intertidal. When we move to 2050, what we see is the water is starting to expand. The edges are starting to come up, move a little bit out of our current marsh areas, particularly along this portion of the road. And then by 2100, I mean, this whole area is underwater at high tide. Okay, so the big question that we need to struggle with as we're building, I said, you know, we built a lot of infrastructure when we didn't know how things were changing. And now we actually have a much better idea of how things are changing and how they're going to change moving forward. So how do we bring that into our structure of our society and into our infrastructure and the way we build things so that we don't have a crisis in 30 years from now, but rather that we've brought that into our thinking. As I said, we're not going to take questions right now. We're holding them till the end. But this is my email address. If you have questions, particularly if you're out of state and are interested in resources for your area, please feel free to email me. I am always happy to email people. All right, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing and pass this back.
Great, thanks so much, Molly. I think that was a great overview of a lot of the emerging conditions we're seeing, what we're already facing. So now to kind of carry on from that, to think about how state agencies are starting to respond and adapt to these changing conditions. We have Dr. Junie Ming, so I'm going to pass it along to him.
Hold on 1 second. And oh, sorry. I need a 1 second. Can you see my screen?
That's great.
Yes.
Okay, see me. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Ross, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Junie Ming. I'm going to briefly talk about the consideration of climate change for bridge design. The information is included in the chapter 33, part 2 of the manual of the structure and bridge division of VDOT. Next. So this is the outline of my presentation. First of all, I'll talk about why we consider climate change in bridge design. Then we have 4 focused areas for bridge design. One is temperature changes, salinity, and rainfall intensity discharge, and the sea level rise. At the end of my presentation, I'll talk about flexible design. It's good seeing Molly did a great job, so make my presentations much easier. Why consider climate change in bridge design? Historically, the bridge design life like 50 years. We adopted a new bridge design specification in 2007, which pushed the bridge design life to 75 years. And in addition, we have been using new materials and technologies in bridges. For example, we're using high performance concrete in all bridge elements since 2003. And we have been using corrosion resistant reinforcing steel since 2009. We use carbon fiber pre-stress in strength in pre-stressed concrete piles since 2017. So this new materials and technologies results in service life pushing to 100 year and probably longer, even longer. So 100-year service requires bridge designer to consider long-term consequences of the bridge layout, location, and clearance. The structure and the bridge division are sort of like proactively developing chapter 33 because of these reasons. Mr. Chris Swanson in VDOT is leading a VDOT Resilience working group developing a higher level policy. So we will modify chapter 33 accordingly when the department's policy comes up. And yeah, climate change causes many issues, like Molly just pointed out. For bridge design, we focus on 4 areas. In 2017, we asked the Research Council, VDOT has a Research Council, did some literature survey and provide us some recommendations for the following 4 areas. One is do changes in temperature affect bridge design parameters, and Molly just talked about climate change will increase air temperature, and as the sea levels rise, how far does the salinity boundary move? And what rainfall intensity discharge shall we now design it for? And what sea level rise shall we expand it to occur by the year of 2100? And Research Council completed 2 research reports. One was 2018 consideration for integrating climate adaptation measures in readout structure and structure design decisions. This research touched the 4 areas I just mentioned. And another research report was 2019 incorporating potential climate changing impact in bridge and culvert design. This research focused on rainfall intensity and the discharge, are primarily conducted by University of Virginia researchers. Chapter 33, based on their research findings, discussion with our hydraulic engineers and some consultants. So I don't want to go through the details, of some formulas, equations, but this is one of the 4 areas we focus on. So temperature changes. The left side, the delta L is a change in length of bridge due to temperature changes. Alpha is the coefficient of thermal expansion, is constant. So delta T is a temperature range or differential temperature we designed for bridges. So in Virginia, we designed from 0 degrees to 120 degrees. So the temperature range is 120 degrees minus 0. So it's basically we designed for 120 degrees differential temperature. We don't design absolute temperature for bridge design. So L is the length of the bridge. The research indicated that by mid-century, the coldest day of the year will see an increase of 5 degrees, and the warmest day of the year is expected to see an increase of almost 60 degrees. 6 degrees, it's not 60. So the design temperature range will be from 5 degrees to 126 degrees. So the differential temperature will be 126 minus 5 is 121. It's close to what we're using now is 120 degrees. So for bridge design, we don't need to consider temperature changing at this point. If in 10 years we have a new information, probably we need to revisit this part. Okay, the second one is salinity. And climate change will cause sea level rise. Sea level rise will cause intrusion of salty water towards inland. We developed this map for bridge design. So within the red line in that area, the corrosion resistance, pre-stressing stress in pre-stressed concrete piles are required. So based on Research Council's research, we modified the red lines. So we post the left side towards inland. So the previous version, actually the left side is closer to the east side. And third area we're concerned with is a rainfall intensity and discharge. This is a big thing, just like Molly just talked about. The Research Council and the University of Virginia, they did this research, and the research indicated there has been a consistent increase in the rainfall intensity and discharge at the rainfall station across the Commonwealth. So consider the research results and simplifying the design process. We request 20% increase in rainfall intensity and a 25% increase in discharge for design of bridges. So deck drainage, we consider 20% increase for scour analysis, stream pressure, and the buoyancy. We consider like a 200-year flood event. And the 200 flood events approximately corresponds to a 25% increase of discharge over the present day in a 100-year flood event. So sea level rise. And Virginia issued 2 executive orders regarding climate change. I guess Molly just mentioned. Executive Order 24 states water levels in Hamilton Roads Ridge are now 18 inches higher than they were centuries ago. So sea level rise is a fact. Sea level rise is has been happening. Executive Order 45 select the novel intermediate high scenario curve for design of state-owned buildings. So we use this curve for bridge design tools. I'm only just mentioning this tool. So we use a 50-year mid-life estimate for bridge longevity. So chapter 33 was published in the year of 2020. So plus 50 as 2070. So the 2070 year corresponded to 4 feet sea level rise. This the chart on the slide is in the vertical axis. The unit is meters, so it's about 4 feet. So we use a 4 feet for sea level rise for bridge design at this point. I just introduced quickly NOAA that provide a sea level rise viewer, so you can Google it, and it's a very interesting tool. So on the left side, this is the condition, is the current condition without any sea level rise. But the right side, if you move the slide on the left side, 2 to 4 feet, you will see the the sea level rise, the clouds that those are like a new water levels. We encourage people to use this for preliminary design. So sea level rise affect bridge design in many ways. So like layout and profile bridges, structure design of bridges, possible relocation of the roadway alignment or location of the bridge, obviously the environmental impacts. We realized not all projects can be designed for 4 feet sea level rise, obviously, because part is like funding or the access issues, this kind of thing. So we provide some guidelines that the designer can use to justify when you should consider 4 feet sea level rise and when you may make some adjustment on the effect of sea level rise. The bullets on the left side of this slide is actually copied from the second column in the table. So we list those factors when you design or plan a bridge. So maybe there's more. So this is what we can can think about it back that time. So if your condition, your project condition meet the condition at the middle column, so you probably likely need to consider 4 feet of civil level rise. If your project condition is close to the condition at in the last column, so you can make some adjustment, or even don't think about the sea level rise. Given an example, the road 1, a redundancy route. If your project is only way in out, there's no redundant route, so you probably need to consider sea level rise. If you have several alternative routes, so you probably don't need to consider the sea level rise. Like a route 10, navigable route on if it's a bridge across navigable route, you need to consider the sea level rise, obviously. If not, probably you don't need to consider. So we give the authority to the district bridge engineer. They can determine whether or not consider sea level rise. Okay, this is one very interesting concept. We can handle bridge design with considering sea level rise. You may design a bridge for the current conditions and the future conditions with consider 4 feet sea level rise. But you can build the bridge to meet the current requirements, the conditions. And in the future, if necessary, somebody can raise the superstructure and with a modified the substructure, so resolve the sea level rise issues. I think that's my last page. If you have any questions, you can ask me today or send me This is my email address. You can send me or call me. Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Thanks so much, Junie. I think that was a really great presentation just to see how VDOT's really being proactive on a lot of these considerations. So we certainly appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
And share my screen. Okay, everyone can see my slides. Excellent. Cool. Well, thanks again for having me, y'all. I do appreciate the time to talk with everyone. So for this last section of the webinar today, we really wanted to think about how local governments are starting to use some of this information and how that's informing, in this case, specifically design standards. So, before we kind of kick this off, just in terms of why this matters for local planners, this is probably not news to anyone on the call, but planners, especially local planners, are really on the front lines for flood mitigation and resiliency initiatives in general in the state. Obviously, in terms of land use decisions, administering state and federal policies, enforcement, administering federal and state funding, perhaps also most importantly, just dealing with citizens. If a community member is angry about flooding in someone's neighborhood, local staff are usually the ones getting a call. So these are pretty big issues affecting a lot of folks. Again, to kind of kick things off, I should note that there is a mandate for planning for sea level rise and resiliency in the state. Within the Tidewater region, so both of these blue areas on the map, comprehensive plans have to include a comprehensive coastal resource management plan. And then within the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, that darker blue area on the map, comprehensive plans also have to incorporate strategies to combat projected sea level rise. I'll also just note that in the 2022 General Assembly session, there was a bill to require all locality comp plans statewide to consider strategies for climate resilience. That was left in subcommittee this year. So the example we wanted to give today is based in Virginia Beach. We're going to look at how they were able to use some of this data to inform and update their design standards. But I also just wanted to include a link to the city's Sea Level Wise website. For those of you who might not know, essentially that's the city's comprehensive program for addressing flood risk and sea level rise. So it's a really great example of sort of a really innovative, forward-thinking locality, or how they're really planning for not just sea level rise or high tide or high wind, but how all of these different conditions kind of overlap with precipitation and rainfall and can exacerbate flooding in a lot of different communities. So just to kick this off again, one of the first studies we found that was really trying to quantify the look at precipitation we've seen came from 2016. Peter Pomerink is a staff member at the city of Virginia Beach, and he put together this study that looked at trends in precipitation at the Norfolk Airport. And so just one interesting thing to note here, he found that the total annual rainfall has trended up over the last 70 years from about 43 inches to 50 inches at the airport. But it's important to note that the days with rainfall remain pretty solid, pretty stable, but it's that annual rainfall depth that's increased. So we're seeing more precipitation with the same number of rainy days, which does make sense. Molly referenced this a little bit, but warmer temperatures, warmer air can hold more water vapor. So it kind of backs up what we're seeing anecdotally and makes sense. In 2018, the city kind of took a bigger step and contracted with the firm Dewberry to do a really in-depth study looking at the analysis of historical and future heavy precipitation. This is a graphic showing an annual max 24-hour rainfall in Virginia Beach, going back actually from 1870 to 2015. So that's a great resource, and I've got a link there for folks who might want to take a look at it. But the big takeaway is that Dewberry recommended increasing existing design guidelines by 20% based on the changes we've already seen and future climate projections. And I'm not sure if I referenced this, but I've got a lot of links in my slides. So I know that the folks at APVA are going to be sending these out later. So don't worry about copying down any URLs. You'll be able to have all that information. So Virginia Beach, like I said, they really took the initiative to have this larger study with Dewberry, but beyond that, taking the next step, that Dewberry study actually impacts Virginia Beach's design standards. So the city released their new design standards manual in March of 2022, and they referenced that study and used that as justification to increase rainfall frequency depths, to increase those values by 20%. So that takes into account, like I said, the kind of the increases we're already seeing, and looking forward 30 years into the future, where we can expect to see, increased additional rainfall. So it's very impressive that Virginia Beach is able to do that. We know that a lot of localities aren't going to have the resources or the capacity to have a big engineering study looking at some of these precipitation events. And Molly's already referenced this, but just want to make sure everyone has the access to the tool. Marissa, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Integrated Science and Assessments program, they've created this projected IDF curve that has a lot of different data for all regions of the state. And the big takeaway there is that, throughout the state, really regardless of recurrence interval, regardless of scenarios, time periods, we should expect to see increases in extreme precipitation. Their study found increases between 8% to 20%. And again, there's the link to the tool right there. So, as I say, Virginia Beach has been really proactive on this, but there are also real big statewide consequences to this data and to the effects we're seeing. So for folks who don't know, the federal standard reference source for drainage design is Atlas 14. And one of the big takeaways through the Virginia Coastal Master Plan was recognizing that Atlas 14 is outdated based on the precipitation trends we're seeing. And so a big recommendation coming from that study was to, or that plan was to update Atlas 14. So currently Virginia has partnered with Delaware, Maryland, and North Carolina to fund a future update. I believe that it's expected to occur to be finalized sometime around June 2024. It's a little ways out, so there's still some, that's subject to change, but I think we can expect to see this update occurring in kind of the summer of 2024. So in general, we've seen this Dewberry study where they found and recommended a 20% increase in precipitation. We've seen the work from Marissa that showed anywhere between 8 to 20% increase in precipitation. We can assume that this Atlas 14 update is going to show higher precipitation trends and have higher design storms as a result. So why that matters for the state is because, and I've linked to the Virginia code here, but because Atlas 14 is what design storms are designed to, as that gets updated, as that precipitation increases, that's going to result in new stormwater standards statewide. So Virginia Beach has taken a proactive stance. They've gotten ahead of that, but this is something that we should expect all localities to eventually have to deal with, something that's definitely coming down the pipeline. And then if you want, like I said, I've got the links to the code there, but also to Atlas 14, if you want to take a look at some of the data. So that's just one example of how a locality is addressing increased precipitation in the state. But really, we kind of wanted to use that as an example of going into some of the other topics we want to talk about with these webinars that we're kind of putting together. So I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about future topics that we'd like to show in future webinars, and then ideally leave a little bit of time. So I know we might have some questions we want to get into. But working with Elizabeth at VCPC, we've kind of put together this rough draft of the ideas we're thinking for future topics. So one of the things we were thinking about covering would be the new Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act regulatory amendments that are addressing climate change. We also thought about septic and groundwater impacts. So issues with failing septic systems, saltwater intrusion, rising water tables. Also want to look at housing impacts, potentially maybe thinking about the connection between redline communities and their vulnerability to flooding. This is one of those examples where we really want to have some locality experience. With all of these webinars, we're hoping to have folks from state agencies and from localities, especially Virginia being a Dillon rural state. We know it's valuable to see how other localities have addressed some of these issues. Another big topic that we'd like to cover is the National Flood Insurance Risk Rating 2.0. That's quite a significant update to the NFIP that has a lot of ramifications for policyholders in Virginia. That's kind of been a hot button topic in a lot of communities. We've gotten a lot of requests from civic leagues and different neighborhood groups who are kind of confused about what Risk Rating 2.0 actually means to them. And then also we'd like to talk about the community rating system. In the past few years, we've had some really kind of exemplary participation in the CRS, and some localities are really starting to score quite highly within the CRS. And so if folks don't know what the community rating system is, it's essentially a subset of the National Flood Insurance Program. Localities can enroll in it, and it basically rewards strong floodplain management by, so it's a point system essentially. And so as you enroll and you do more activities that have more stringent floodplain management, you get rewarded with points that correspond to your CRS score. The lower score you have corresponds to a reduction in flood insurance premiums. So it's a great program. A lot of localities in Virginia are enrolled. And then finally, we're thinking about having a topic on funding for resiliency efforts. So some of the innovative things that localities are doing, just as an example, maybe reviewing Hampton's environmental impact bond, some of the lessons learned from the state's community flood preparedness program. And then one topic that I think would be really interesting, especially for more rural localities, is the Fight the Flood program coming from the Mendel Peninsula. That's essentially a program that connects property owners with funding mechanisms and contractors to actually really create a lot of resiliency on private property, which is a huge issue. And they're really moving that forward and getting a lot more engagement with the private land, because obviously that's a huge issue, especially in rural areas. So when we go back to questions, I'm going to leave on this slide because I think it's a good jumping off point. We definitely want to get some feedback on, do these topics make sense? Or is there something we're missing? Is there a big issue that you'd like to see reviewed soon? Obviously, there's been a lot of work happening at the state level over the past couple of years, so there's a lot of different topics to cover. But before we get into that, just briefly, this series of webinars is also tied into a project we've been working on with APAVA and the Virginia Environmental Endowment. Essentially, we've been trying to create a curriculum of training materials for planning staff and planning commissioners. We found that there's sometimes been a disconnect between ideas that the staff are proposing. There's sort of just a disconnect between the staff and planning commissioners. We want to make sure folks are speaking the same language on issues, that folks are seeing kind of how other localities in Virginia are addressing some of these things. So we've been working also with the land use education program on their planning commission trainings. And once these modules are finalized, there'll be I think a nice follow-on resource to the webinars we're discussing. A lot of videos, it's very interactive. We're reviewing these modules now, and actually if anyone would like to volunteer to review this data and this work we're putting together, we've got a few stakeholders who've already volunteered their time, but we're always happy to have more. So my contact information is at the end of this email, or at the end of this slideshow. And then just a couple more tools. The first thing we really did with that planning commissioner, planning staff training program was to update our local adaptation guide. This is something that we've had for a few years. It's basically kind of a repository of model easement language, model ordinance language, strategies for improving CRS scores, how localities are thinking about different planning and regulatory strategies, all that good stuff. So that's been updated. Still making some small changes, but that's live if anyone wants to use this reference. And then Molly also referenced Adapt Virginia, but for folks who don't know, that's really a one-stop shop kind of information gateway for climate change information. This is something that VCPC and Wetlands Watch work together with VIMS on. And then especially, I've got a link to the interactive viewer that really is a very strong resource to look at critical infrastructure, social vulnerability, sea level rise projections, areas for nature and natural based infrastructure. It's really comprehensive and it's a great tool. And you can also contact me if you'd ever like to schedule a time to review that information. But I know we're running a little bit short now, so I'm going to go back to this feature topic slide, and we can kind of open it up to questions, discussions. Like I said, we'd love to get your feedback on how these topics, how they appeal to you, how applicable they are to the work you're all doing. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Ross. So you have heard Ross give the breakdown of some of the potential topics, and you see them in front of you now. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. This team would really like your input.
And as you're filling this out, everyone, we would love to know what topics you'd like to hear about. And if there's a particular order in which you'd like to hear them, please put that in the Q&A box if you think it's important to hear about some that are more pressing than others. All of your help would be Very welcome. Thank you.
We have John Bateman putting in as we wait for the others to come in on the poll. John Bateman has said CBPA is pressing. I'm going to go ahead and end this poll.
And perhaps we need to note that for those who may not know, that the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act is the CBPA state law. There was new guidance adopted recently to reflect the new regulations, or actually it hasn't been adopted yet. New regulations that were adopted and the guidance of the development, but that's what that's reflecting. And it seems like that got 9 out of 67. Septic, obviously there's interest, and housing impacts. All right, thank you all. That's very helpful. And the funding. Okay, I think there's a question, isn't there? I think for Johnny in the Q&A, Jillian.
Yes. Oh yeah, well, it looks like Jeannie has gone ahead and answered it, but just for the benefit of everyone, Bill Pugh had asked, how much do these needed new design standards increase the typical unit costs of new bridge and road infrastructure? Are cost estimates for many planned new bridges and highway expansions in VA underestimated? And Jeannie commented that because Chapter 33 provides new guidelines, he has not yet gathered the cost information. And then just some input from attendees. Jessica Steelman has suggested perhaps septic and groundwater first, with housing impacts next, followed by the others. In terms of the topics for the future webinars.
Thanks.
And if anyone kind of has an idea after the webinar that seems pressing now that you've had some time to marinate on it, feel free to reach out to me or Elizabeth, and we can certainly take that into consideration as well.
I see Doug Mosley's comments, and
yes.
And you said that you'd be curious to see some discussion of the upcoming effort to rewrite the state's erosion sediment control and stormwater management, the manual. That's an excellent point. We did talk about stormwater, of course, being something that's worth exploring some more with the increasing intensity of the precipitation that Molly just went through. So yeah, that's absolutely one that we could do as well. Thank you. And you noted the Virginia Advisory Group meets for the first time on July 12th. So that is pressing, that is soon.
Jeffrey Harvey is asking if there's a timeline for when the new rainfall data will be included in the state stormwater regulations.
I'm not aware of one. I don't know, Molly, are you? No. We can certainly double check. And it sounds like having the Department of Environmental Quality perhaps come and speak to us about the stormwater and erosion sediment control updates would be of interest to a number of people.
And I'll just add, just while any other questions come in potentially by the end, that all of these slide decks will be sent out in an e-blast and it will include links to our YouTube page, which will have this recording and any other resources that might have been included within the slide decks themselves.
We want to say thank you to Dr. Mitchell. She does have to pop out a little bit early due to another commitment. But thank you to all of our panelists as well, and to the APA for hosting this webinar series. We hope you all find it helpful as you're down in the trenches dealing with the real world issues. We would really like to feature real world examples of things. So if you have suggestions, such as the Virginia Beach one that Ross went through, if you have suggestions, please do share. Thank you. How land use planning and redevelopment strategies can help address stormwater is an important one. Thank you, Bill. Yeah.
Any other last questions? Or any last comments from any of the presenters?
Thank you for your feedback, everyone, and thank you to our speakers. We will, and if you have any feedback that you want to share afterwards, as Ross mentioned, please don't hesitate to email him or to email me. I'm at eaandrews@wm.edu. And we would look forward to any feedback or examples you might want to provide to us. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone.